gospel lesson that Teresa and I just read is a familiar one to many. One of Jesus' famous parables from the Gospel of Luke. This parable, the one about a widow seeking justice, is one that we have heard often and many have taken to heart. In this parable, this widow apparently has an unjust judgment levied against her. She continually pesters the judge, who, because of her perseverance, amazingly gives in and renders the judgment in her favor. The judge even says, "Though I do not respect anyone, even God, I will grant this widow justice because she keeps bothering me." Now, on the surface, this parable can be comforting to those in distress, those who are severely afflicted, as it says in our psalm this morning that we read. Those who struggle against the trials of life are affirmed that if they continue to persevere in prayer, they might be successful in their endeavors, just like the widow today. The follower of Luke, who wrote this wisdom down some 50 years or so after Jesus died, even tries to interpret Jesus' wisdom for us today by opening the parable with the words, "And then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and never lose heart." Now, sometimes gospel writers, and Luke in particular, add a little bit of interpretation to Jesus' wisdom. Jesus didn't tell them that this parable was about the need to pray always and never lose heart. In fact, if you read the few lines of Jesus' speech after the parable, you will see that it's not necessarily about the need to pray always and never lose heart, or not just about that. The interpretation about praying and never losing heart is Luke's interpretation as he records this, not necessarily Jesus' wisdom. And sometimes, when working with the Bible, we need to know the difference. That's what I like about the Gospel of Mark. Mark's Gospel has the least editorial commentary and interpretation in it. Luke, Matthew, and John, they had their own things that they wanted to get across when they shared Jesus' wisdom with us, but Mark was only interested in facts. This is what Jesus said, now you go figure it out for yourself. Now, that doesn't mean the Gospel of Luke is any less important or any less authoritative than the Gospel of Mark. Were it not for the Gospel of Luke, we wouldn't have this parable. We wouldn't have the parable of the Good Samaritan. We wouldn't have the parable of the rich man who built bigger barns. We wouldn't have the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And of course, we would not have the birth narratives of Jesus with Mary and Joseph finding no room in the inn and Jesus being born in the stable and laid to rest in a manger. Those are all unique to Luke. And they are very important parts of God's wisdom for us. But it's important to remember when reading the gospel narratives that Luke put a lot of commentary into the book. And we need to realize what is Luke's commentary and what is Jesus' wisdom. Luke's commentary is important. But as Pastor John Robinson told the pilgrims as they departed on the Mayflower, there is still more light and truth to break forth from God's holy word. Or, as the United Church of Christ says, God is still speaking. If we listen to the still speaking God, we see that there is more depth to the parable than just about the need to pray always and never lose heart. This parable is about more than just a widow getting what she deserves. This parable is about more than just a judge finally doing what is right. This parable is about justice. We see that much in Jesus' words after he gets done telling the parable. He says, "Will not God grant justice for God's chosen ones? I tell you," he says, "God will grant justice to them, and yet, will God find faith on earth?" These closing statements by Jesus are more revealing than the parable itself in many ways. This closing judgment from Jesus indicts us all in our complacency in unjust situations. This closing accusation from Jesus emboldens us all to be justice seekers, working for God's will in the world. For if we do not, Will we truly find faith here on earth? Will God truly find faith here on earth? This past week, I was watching a TV show about Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War era of our country. The period of civil war in our country was a time that most of us can't even begin to imagine. We think we live in a fractured country today, but things were so much worse in the 1860s that today's divisiveness would seem like a walk in the park by comparison. The divisiveness of the United States was part of our structure from the beginning of our country, as southern states insisted on retaining the institution of slavery. Despite the longings of Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, and others to eliminate the institution of slavery from the birth of this nation, and despite the fact that slavery was actually dying out when this country came together, emancipation was not to happen at that time and that place. So the institution continued, and all the while the Founding Fathers assumed that it would die out within a generation. And then what happened? The cotton gin was invented. Eli Whitney came along. It revived the cotton industry in the South, and with it a resurgence of the institution of slavery. The 1800s saw this resurgence, and tensions began. From 1800 to 1860, many unjust articles of legislation and judgment, including the Missouri Compromise and the Dred Scott decision, buttressed the institution of slavery. By 1860, slavery was a booming business, despite the injustice of any one person telling another person that they are only 5/8 of a human being. Our country descended into war based on the defense of an unjust institution. And in 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, trying to bring justice to an unjust situation. From that day on, men and women would be free no matter who they were or where they were on life's journey. It took almost 70 years of persistence on the part of abolitionists to eliminate the injustice of slavery. 70 years of abolitionists crying out, "Grant me justice against my opponent." Some of the most passionate abolitionists were our ancestors here in this church. Our ancestors, the German evangelical settlers who came to this era in the 1850s, our ancestors came to this area fleeing the oppression of Germany, or what was called Prussia then. So when they got here and saw oppression here, oppression against the black people, they were irate. These German evangelical Christians, who were the founder of this and other churches all over this area that are now United Churches of Christ, were among the most passionate abolitionists out there. Our ancestors lobbied legislatures to abolish slavery and preached against the institution, even risking death to do so. You've heard the story of the pastor at Ebenezer Stone Church who preached against slavery, and the slave farm down the road came up to kill him, to hang him, and he had to flee into the woods to escape there. Some of you who have been here for a while know that story. Our community is built on the heritage of those who cried out to the unjust judge, "Grant me justice against my opponent." But of course, even when the Civil War ended in 1865, the war for justice was not over. Other states continued to come up with new unjust ways to oppress the black community based solely in racism, hatred, and fear. They established voting laws to keep black people out of the polls, created zoning laws to keep black people from moving into their neighborhoods, and created application laws to keep black people from applying to their white colleges. Even into the 1960s, much of the South, black people could not use the same restrooms as white people, eat at the same lunch counters as white people, or drink from the same drinking fountains as white people. Many of us today do not realize that until 1964, interracial marriage was illegal in Missouri. I can't comprehend anyone legislating marriage, telling two people in love that they cannot marry one another because of the way God made them. But until 1964, it was so here in Missouri. Black and white people understood the injustice of the situation and cried out, "Grant me justice against my opponent." Finally, justice won the day. The persistent widow of civil rights won out against the forces of injustice that sought to keep God's children subjugated forever. Of course, amazing persistence is about more than just the African American community. Women had the same struggle for justice as well. Think about the women's suffrage movement. The movement to give women the legal right to vote began in 1848, and yet the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote, didn't pass until 1920. It's hard to believe that for the first 144 years of this country, women were told that they couldn't vote. Esther Taylor, the beloved matriarch of our church, who died earlier this year, was 6 weeks old when women gained the right to vote. For over 70 years, men and women cried out that it was unjust for us to deny women the right to vote. They cried out, "Grant me justice against my opponent." They had amazing persistence all those years, and eventually they gained the right to vote. But of course, like the fight for civil rights, their fight for justice from their opponent was far from over. The ensuing 96 years since then have brought many challenges to women trying to break the glass ceiling in the corporate world and in life in general. Even today, a woman with an MD behind her name is not called a doctor by some, but a lady doctor. A woman with a JD behind her name is not called a lawyer by some, but a lady lawyer. And a woman with Reverend in front of her name is not called a pastor by some, but rather a woman pastor. Even today, the fight for justice is not over. The widow must continue to be persistent. As lovers and followers of the gospel, we must continue to say, "Grant me justice against my opponent." The last line of gospel that we read, what Jesus said as he relates this parable to his friends, is a challenge for us all. Emphasizing the importance of our fight for justice, Jesus says, "When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" Jesus is equating faith with the fight for justice. If we are to be truly faithful to Jesus and his wisdom, we must fight for justice. If we are truly to be Christ's disciples, we must fight for justice. If we are truly going to WWJD, then we must fight for justice. As I say often, believing in Jesus is not enough. It's not good enough to sit at home and say, "I believe in Jesus, that's all I need to do. I don't need to fight for justice. I don't need to be part of a community of faithful people, all passionately working for God's will in the world. I just need to believe in God and I'll be happy." That's not what Jesus tells us. That's not what he says in this gospel lesson. Jesus tells us that if we are going to be faithful, we must fight for justice. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Or will he find scores of people blissfully believing in God but doing nothing about it? We must fight for justice. Lucky for us, it's not that hard. It's in our DNA. It's part of who we are as evangelical Germans and as the United Church of Christ. We have fought for justice for generations, from abolition of slavery to women's suffrage to civil rights to religious freedom to marriage equality for everyone, no matter who they are. The fight for justice has always been a part of our heritage, our identity, and today it's an important part of who we are as the United Church of Christ. As a church, we work for justice in many ways. For women at Lydia's house, working for justice. For the folks in Chiapas, Mexico, we are working for justice. With Church World Services and the Crop Walk bringing clean water for everyone, we are working for justice. As a denomination, we fight for justice whether it is racial, economic, environmental, or social. We fight for justice because Jesus told us to. And in our fight for justice, we make God's kingdom come, God's will be done, a little bit more here on earth. But justice doesn't happen overnight. Justice doesn't come easy. Like the widow in today's parable, we are called to have amazing perseverance. Justice will be worked through us because we are God's miracle workers. In this church and in this denomination, We are especially equipped to follow the mandate of Jesus' wisdom in that gospel lesson we read this morning. We are God's miracle workers because we fight for justice. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Let's hear a resounding yes.
Yes.
When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?
Yes.
When the Son of Man comes, will he find justice on earth?
Yes.
May it be so. Amen.